Evergreen has been misunderstood because for most people it didn't exist in their minds until they saw it go crazy in the episode that actually brought Heather and me to prominence. And that has always been a bit of a bitter pill for us because Evergreen was simultaneously an amazing place and a tragic failure to live up to its potential. And, before Evergreen blew up, we were basically voices shouting into the wind about the central flaw of the place, right? We wanted to cure it, and there was no appetite for curing it. And I wanted to just say what I think it was, and then talk a little bit about your experience, because, frankly, I think if people got to know some of the folks who had graduated from Evergreen and gotten something out of it, they would have a very different sense that this wasn't a demonstration that a radical departure from the educational model was inherently a mistake, because it wasn't. So the flaw, as I see it, well, the beauty, I used to say Evergreen was, the founders threw out absolutely everything from a normal university or college and replaced it with something else. And half of what they did was brilliant and half of it was crazy. And that the only problem was that we never got around to saying, all right, which fraction doesn't work, and getting rid of that. That would have been a perfectly good process.
That would be the next step in the experiment, right?
Sure should have been. So the biggest flaw that I see, or the biggest value, was that professors were liberated to teach whatever they wanted to teach in whatever way they wanted to teach it, which sounds like a recipe for disaster. But the fact is, if you're interested in teaching, and the place was founded around the idea that teaching should be paramount, right? But if you had an appetite to figure out what could be done that nobody had ever done before in a classroom, then you could do it. You could figure it out. And what viewers, most of them will not know, is that structure involved what were called full-time programs, where you, as a student, take one class full-time, professor teaches one class full-time, and those programs could go on for a full year. And what that does, especially with the low professor-to-student ratio, or the high professor-to-student ratio, the low student-professor ratio, but the what that does is it means that professors and students know each other very, very well. Right. Yeah. And it means that the professor, if they have an appetite for it, can figure out, even down to the individual mind in the classroom, what is that person hung up on, right? You know what's going on, and that process is potentially great.
Yeah.
Right. That was the awesome part. Bad part was,
and I would add to that,
that
some of those full-time programs were taught by multiple professors from across discipline. So in just painting the picture, that was part of it too.
Yep.
Right.
It
would sometimes be a team of 2 or 3 professors that are ushering the same group of students through a program for a year.
Yeah. Team teaching. Yep. And those programs were, often students didn't know this, but those programs were just inventions. Right? One professor sits down next to another professor someday, and they have a conversation in which they're each focused on their own thing. And it's like, well, actually, this conversation's pretty good. I wonder if we could build a program around that.
Yeah.
The bad part, though, is you get hired at Evergreen. It's not obvious that just because you got a PhD somewhere in some subject that you're going to be any good at all at figuring out how to teach if you're completely free. Right? Lots of people aren't. And so what I would have done if I had the ability to fix it is, after you're hired, there's a period of 3 years, maybe it would be 5 years, in which you have to demonstrate that you can figure out what to do with all that freedom. And if at the end of that period you're doing a great job and students are feeling really, energized by what you're doing, right, you stay. And if you can't figure it out in that period of time, doesn't matter how much we like you, you should go, right? Because that spot that you're in, that is Evergreen, the faculty used to say, it didn't pay in money, it paid in freedom. right? Those were glorious positions, not because of what they paid, but basically because if you had a taste for the work, right, it was rewarding. You knew why you were there every day, right?
Yeah.
And so by not having that process in which we selected for people who actually were good at figuring out what to do with freedom, it resulted in basically there were some professors who were great, and there were some professors who basically used it as an excuse not to work, right? So anyway, for somebody who clearly got a lot out of the thing, I'd be interested to know what's your overarching, you were, how many classes with Heather and me did you take?
Just the one.
Just the one.
Yeah. Animal behavior and zoology.
Animal behavior and zoology.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you were co-teaching it together.
Yeah.
Which I know you didn't always teach as a team, but that year you were teaching as a team.
Yeah, we taught as a team that year, which we did a number of times. And then we also had the experience of teaching separately. And there was a group of students who would bounce from one of our programs to the other, right? There was like a large group of students who had become interested in evolution as a result of the fact that there were two of us, teaching related topics, and we had very different styles. And anyway, that seemed to work for a lot of people, even to the point that many students would continue to show up for class even after they were no longer registered with one of us, even sometimes after they graduated, because they got so used to the idea that there was a community of people who spoke the same language that they would.
I think I did that one year. I came through Olympia and I found out you were teaching in a lecture hall, and I sat in on a lecture on gay dinosaurs.
Gay dinosaurs, yes. Right. Yeah, that would have been a lecture that was part of a two-part lecture that I did where a student, Colin, who was quite paleontologically expert, had teamed up with me. And so basically it was about the evolution of homosexuality, and I did the human part of it, which was a topic I had become interested in, and he did a kind of survey of other things, and the grand finale was gay dinosaurs.
Gay dinosaurs, yeah.
Which, it's amazing that
clearly stuck with me.
Yeah, right. You remember it all these years later. But all right, so what was your experience at Evergreen? To the extent that people don't understand what the place was, what can you tell them?
Yeah, well, so the hazard you identify was clear to me, and I think to most of the students too. You'd have this thing called the academic fair, where all the professors are sitting at individual tables, and you, as a student, have the opportunity to decide, where am I going to commit an entire year of my education?
Yep.
And that's risky business, in that if you hit a stinker,
big waste.
It's a big waste. And so was both the strength and the weakness of this. Back to your get rid of the folks who don't know what to do with this. I was trying to navigate a landscape where there were folks who knew what to do with it and folks who didn't. And as a student, you're coming into it and you're trying to assess. And often the folks who did know what to do with it, their classes were waitlisted. There was a vicious process of trying to get in. I mean, I know with you and Heather, you always had wait lists. People were trying to get in. People were writing you love letters,
So many.
Please, please, please.
Right.
But once you were in that cohort, and you were invested for a year, I mean, you could do fantastic stuff. You could go take the entire cohort out of state for months on end.
Yeah.
Because why
They
have
don't
the
have
college?
anything. They don't have anything else they're committed to doing.
They don't have anything else they're committed to doing. Yeah, and like if you don't need the lab, then
Right.
why else? So I thought that was. I loved Evergreen. I came to it with someone who had a severe tracking difficulty, which I eventually worked on. But like if I'm reading music or whatever, at the time, I go 1, 2, 5. Oh, back here. Which made it difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. Evergreen was a place where those of us who had those sorts of, different ways, learning disabilities, right, or whatever you want, you could just kind of sweep it aside because it was a very different model. It was like, well, where are you at on the content?
Yep.
and there's many ways to approach understanding the content. I remember, so after your class, I went to a class that was kind of pre-med school. We got really deep in all the pre-med school subjects, and it was kind of stressful because they was like, oh, are you going to be a doctor or not? Even at Evergreen, they still somehow cultivated that vibe. So I would get stressed out and take my fiddle down to a local pub every Wednesday night and play Irish tunes with folks. There was like a bottomless pitcher of dark ale and light ale for anyone who came in and could halfway play an instrument. That was my little stress release. I was talking to an old guy there at the pub, and I told him I was an Evergreen student. He's like, well, yep, Evergreen, that's a school of deep divers and floaters. Which was kind of my experience too with both teachers and students.
Yeah.
You could choose to deep dive, and it was risky, and there was the promise of great reward. Or you could choose to wear the water wings, and 4 years later you pop out the other side and you have a degree of
value.
dubious value, but it's the same degree that any of the deep divers got too.
Right.
And there was this wonderful thing around, rather than grades, you have the evaluative process where I write an evaluation of you. I say he was great except for his hair. You do the same, and he was great except for his hair.
Right, exactly. And then they match.
And then they match, and then they're forever the record too.
Right.
But that was pretty cool too. I really appreciated that. And especially if you're through the same program for multiple terms, you're doing this evaluation at the end of every single term. I'm mourn that doesn't seem to be there anymore. It was an amazing thing. And I really got a lot out of it. I got a lot out of it from you and Heather. I got a lot out of it. The next year, I was able to do another independent study on whales with a local graduate who started one of the premier research collectives in whale biology. And
I know who you're talking about, but you might.
John Calmakidis, the Cascadia Research Collective. He and a number of Evergreen grads. This is what you could do with an Evergreen education, right? They graduated with bachelor's degrees, and they started an independent science collective.
Yeah. Which is important in whale research and actually bat research in the Puget Sound.
Yeah, and because it cultivated I don't actually have to ask permission to do this.
Right. And that's the thing, is because of the freedom, right? If you couldn't figure out what to do with it as a student, then maybe you didn't get anything out of the process. But if you did, get your bearings, then the point is you came out of it with something that was a lot closer to what graduate school would give you, where you knew how to get stuff done. You didn't need somebody to tell you to do it.
Well, and I'll admit, when I was in your class, I pretended to be a grad student many times, probably mostly. So we were in Olympia for 2 terms, and then I went to Panama. And this is an example of what you can do, right? I proposed a research project out on this island, 14 kilometers out into the Caribbean.
Yep.
I said I want to work on the Pygmy three-toed sloth, and Heather was my advisor. She said, okay. We ended up, I persuaded a few more students to come with me on this crazy adventure, and we ended up doing the first population census of a critically endangered species. Got the thing published, all of that. And I didn't even think about you're not supposed to do that as an undergrad, except for when I would try to access the resources at the Smithsonian Institute in Panama, in which case they would let me in if I pretended to be a grad student. But undergrads, it was a tour experience.
It's funny. I don't know. I don't know that we ever talked about this, or if we did, whether you'll remember it. But I think the reason that you ended up on Pygmy Sloths actually had to do with. Am I correct that the description of the Pygmy Sloth was a Charles Handley paper.
It was Charles Handley, but that wasn't actually the connection.
Oh, it wasn't?
Yeah, I was interested in Antillean manatees. So I started calling all the researchers down there on manatees. And I was like, all right, how do I get it? What are the questions? What are people puzzling on? And I ran into this one guy who said, well, manatees might be hard to tap in with, but there's the sloth.
There's the sloth
on this island. And then, yes, the descriptive paper.
Charles Handley, who was one of my mentors on bats, actually on Barrow, Colorado Island in Panama. He's now gone. But anyway, I think he would have been very pleased that you guys went and studied this very odd creature on this island in the Bocas del Toro, inhospitable little island. But
Escudo de Veraguas.
Yeah, way the hell out there.
Yeah, and we were talking about phenolic compounds earlier. The pygmy sloth is a funny puzzle because they seem to specialize on only mangrove leaves.
Yeah.
And you don't see that, as we were talking about, with grazers and browsers rather, because they're trying to distribute the toxins amongst many different types. But yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting puzzle, and interesting that you were able, as an undergraduate, you were able to, not only manage an actual research project that was able to get to the point of a useful and publishable paper, but to do so under really inhospitable conditions, right? That's an amazing accomplishment.
Yeah, 3 months in a pretty remote place.
Yeah, pretty remote.
But that's what Evergreen enabled. There was no one to say no. Right. You had a guiding mentor in your faculty, and as long as you could convince them that, there was some hope that you would come through it with something that is worth the education.
Yep.
And I learned a lot from that experience.
Well, you mentioned academic fair, which, to be honest with you, I haven't thought about it in some time. But I used to love academic fair.
It's very stressful as a student. That was the dating game.
I used to love it because and most faculty hated it. Right? You had to show up on a day when you would otherwise have been free in the afternoon and sit there for hours. As one student after another would come and sit down in front of you and say, "Well, what's your program going to be about?" But for me, it was an opportunity to, this is going to sound terrible, but because our classes were, for both Heather and me, our classes were always oversubscribed. And that meant that there was actually something to be accomplished in figuring out what students would be best if they got in there, what students had the most to gain from it, and what students brought something to the table that would make the programs lively. And so, I wouldn't just deliver the same, well, what's your program going to be about? Well, we're going to study this, that, and the other, right? I would use it as an opportunity to figure out who was sitting down in that chair in front of me and figure out whether or not they were a good fit. And if they were a good fit, I would do everything in my power to try to get them to sign up. And if they weren't going to be a good fit because they really needed, a syllabus, and they needed to know on what day that, if that was what was going to happen, then I was doing them a favor by driving them off, right? Yep. And so anyway, many of the people who took my programs and went on to do really interesting things and to become friends and people that I admire, I met them at academic fair as they thought they were interviewing me, and I was kind of pushing them around to see whether they could handle it and whether or not it was going to be the kind of thing that was to their taste. So anyway, I have many fond memories of that.
I remember I had to write a essay on trade-offs in order to get into your class.
Oh, were you, you must have been, you weren't, you didn't get in on the normal.
I was late to signing up.
Right.
And I didn't attend academic fair.
Right.
Oh. Yep. And so then I was assigned an essay.
Right. Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah. So, I don't, my hope is that by the time my 3 little ones are at the age where they're looking for a mentor of that caliber, there's a place where mentors have that freedom. I don't know where that is right now, but
it's nowhere right now.
Yeah.
I hope it happens too. I, of course, have one kid right at that age and one kid a couple of years out. And the fact that there's nowhere obvious to send them is so disturbing. And, it is evidence of exactly the same kind of short-sightedness as we were discussing with respect to the destruction of all of the things that the beavers had built into our landscapes, because we are effectively sowing the seeds of our undoing by allowing education to be captured by ideological agendas and just lunacy, right? I mean, how crazy is it that a place, that produced really great students who were capable of, look, you've founded an organization. You are now returning to your former professor and teaching him about, important features of the life of a mammal, even though he's a mammologist, right? So anyway, that kind of liberating encounter with education is tremendously important. There is, people totally misunderstand. Evergreen is a public college.
Right. Yeah.
Why?
Which was one of the reasons I could attend.
Right.
I was on Pell Grant and food stamps, and
it wasn't a place for rich kids. It's
Yeah.
not that there weren't a few there were.
for sure.
But it was a place, it was inexpensive to afford. You could,
Yep.
if you had a learning disability, it wasn't the end of the world. Because
There was 1,100 acres of forest. I came back from Panama. I was like, I'm not going to do a renting a lease thing. And I lived in the forest for the rest of the term.
Did you? Oh, I didn't realize you were.
I was one of
first.
those students. Yeah. Maintained 3 different lockers and showered in the gym.
Yep, this is one of these things that happens at Evergreen. It was a truly special place, and it's very upsetting to me that its legacy is that the lunacy staged a coup, which it did, but that was not the sum total of the story of the place. And for those wishing to build, higher ed 2.0, understanding what Evergreen had right would be crucial.
Yeah.
Right? If you could take the part that Evergreen had right and prune off the part that didn't work, right, then you've got the seed of something really powerful. And you're a testament to that. And I greatly appreciate what you did with the freedom that you had as a result of going there.
Well, thanks.